The obsidian palace did not breathe. It sighed with the weight of 5,000 years of secrets and the cloying scent of dried lilies and ancient, stagnant blood. It was a monolith of volcanic glass and midnight marble carved directly into the throat of the iron crags, where the sun was a rare visitor and the shadows were thick enough to drown in. Talia knelt on the freezing floors of the great vestibule, her fingers raw and trembling. In this world of predators, she was the ghost girl, a flicker of a girl with no past and a future that extended no further than the next bucket of lie. 6 months ago, she had been found in a ravine, her skin scorched white and her mind a shattered mirror. The royal alchemist had declared her a hollowed fledgling, a vampire whose turning had gone so catastrophically wrong that her memory and her thirst were both extinguished. To the aristocrats of the court, she was less than a slave. She was furniture that bled if you kicked it. Still struggling with the grout, little ghost? The voice was like a silk ribbon wrapped around a razor blade. Talia didn't need to look up to know the scent. Black orchids and expensive, copper-heavy vintage blood. Countess Alara stood above her, the hem of her midnight blue gown sweeping over the damp stone Talia had just spent an hour scrubbing. The king's guests arrive in 2 days, Alara purred, her silver-tipped heel coming to rest on the back of Talia's hand. If I see a single speck of dust, I'll have you hung from the ramparts by your Achilles tendons. The crows haven't had a fresh meal in weeks. Talia bit her lip, the iron tang of her own blood blossoming in her mouth. The pressure on her hand increased. She could feel the delicate metacarpals groaning, nearly snapping against the unforgiving marble. Yes, my lady, Talia whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Look at me when I speak to you, wretch. Talia lifted her head. Her eyes were a strange, dull amber, faded like a dying fire. Alara, by contrast, was a masterpiece of lethal beauty. Her skin was the color of cream, her lips a permanent, blood-stained crimson. She was the woman destined to become the new queen, the one to sit beside King Braden and heal the tragedy of his widowed heart. Alara's eyes flickered with a brief, inexplicable flash of hatred, a look so intense it felt as though she wanted to erase Talia from existence. With a sharp laugh, she ground her heel down one last time, the silver spike piercing Talia's skin, before sauntering away toward the high throne. Talia didn't cry. Crying required a sense of self she didn't possess. Instead, she watched the trail of her own blood, unusually bright, almost shimmering, swirl into the lye water. The sun set, and the obsidian palace truly woke. Vampires were creatures of sensory excess. As the moon rose, the palace filled with the thrum of low, bass-heavy music and the frantic heartbeats of the donors. Humans kept in velvet-lined cages, their fear acting as a spice for the elite. But above the music, above the laughter of the cruel and the beautiful, there was the scream. It began every evening at the stroke of midnight. High in the north spire, the infant Prince Leo would begin to wail. It wasn't the cry of a hungry child. It was a sound of primal agony. The court whispered that the boy was cursed, that his mother's light-poisoned blood had ruined him before she turned to ash in the birthing bed. They said the child was a monster, a creature that burned the skin of any nurse who dared touch him. In her cramped cell in the servants' quarters, Talia sat upright. Her heart, usually a silent stone in her chest, gave a violent, agonizing thud. Go to him. The thought wasn't hers. It felt like a memory of a scent, the smell of sun-warmed hay and cedarwood. It felt like the ghost of a touch on her cheek. Talia stood, her bare feet silent on the cold glass floors. She moved through the palace like a shadow's shadow. She passed the great hall, where she caught a glimpse of King Braden. He sat upon the obsidian throne, his silhouette a study in lonely power. He was magnificent in his desolation. His shoulders were broad, draped in heavy furs and black silk. His jawline was a jagged edge of masculine perfection. His hair was the color of a winter night, falling over a brow perpetually furrowed in grief. Braden was known as the Relentless King, a warrior who had united the covens through blood and iron. But as Talia watched from the darkness, she saw him press a shaking hand to his eyes. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of his own making. The prince's scream cut through the air again, more desperate this time. Braden flinched as if struck. Talia turned and ran. She didn't head for her cell. She headed for the spire. The nursery was guarded by 2 massive sentinels, but they were distracted, arguing in low tones about the demon child, and how their skin was still blistering from the previous night's shift. Talia slipped past them using the vents, a trick she'd learned while cleaning the palace's forgotten corners. She dropped into the nursery. The room was a tomb of luxury, silk tapestries, gold-leafed cradles, and toys carved from ivory. In the center of the room sat a black iron crib. The infant inside was small, his skin a translucent, sickly pale. But his eyes, when he opened them to scream, were a shocking, impossible violet. The air around the crib was hot, distorted. It felt like standing too close to a furnace. "Oh, little one," Talia breathed. The child's head snapped toward her. He stopped screaming mid-breath. A heavy, weighted silence fell over the room. Talia approached, her heart hammering a rhythm she hadn't felt in 6 months. Lub-dub. Lub-dub. It was painful. It was life. She reached out a hand. The air scorched her skin, the heat singeing the fine hairs on her arms. Any other vampire would have recoiled. The heat of the sun was their greatest taboo. But Talia felt a strange, magnetic pull. The heat didn't feel like an ending, it felt like a homecoming. She lowered her hand into the crib. The moment her fingers brushed Leo's cheek, a shockwave of gold light erupted from the point of contact. Talia gasped, her knees buckling. Images, vibrant, terrifying, and beautiful, slammed into her mind. A field of lavender, under a gold-leafed sky. The feeling of Braden's lips against her neck, not biting, but kissing with a desperate, soul-deep hunger. The scent of his skin, rain and ozone. The agonizing pain of a silver blade being driven into her womb, and a woman's voice, Alara's voice, whispering, "The king will believe you burned. The world will believe you are ash." Talia's eyes flew open. They were no longer a dull amber. They were glowing with the fierce, unyielding radiance of a midday sun. Leo reached up, his tiny, burning hand curling around her thumb. He didn't burn her. He fed her. The heat from the child flowed into Talia, and the cold, hollow place inside her shattered. "I remember," she whispered, tears of molten light tracking down her face. "I am Talia. I am your mother." The door to the nursery groaned open. Talia froze. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the corridor, was King Braden. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the girl kneeling by the crib. He had come to check on the son he couldn't hold, the son who reminded him too much of the woman he had lost. "You," Braden said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The servant girl." He stepped into the room, his predator's senses flaring. He smelled the ozone. He saw the faint, shimmering light clinging to her skin. But more than that, he felt the blood tie, the ancient metaphysical chain that bound a king to his true mate. It was a bond he believed had been snapped by death. Talia stood slowly, her heart thundering. She wanted to scream his name. She wanted to throw herself into his arms and tell him about the silver blade and Alara's treachery. But as Braden drew closer, his eyes remained hard. The bond was there, but it was being muffled, smothered by a thick, oily layer of dark magic that hung around his neck like an invisible noose. He looked at her, and while his soul recognized her, his mind saw only a trespasser. "Why is my son silent?" Braden demanded, his hand moving to the hilt of the black steel blade at his waist. "What have you done to him, witch?" "I only held him, my lord," Talia said, her voice trembling with the effort to remain calm. She kept her head down, hiding the glowing embers of her eyes. Braden reached her in 2 strides. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. He intended to throw her from the room, but the moment his skin touched hers, he recoiled as if burned. He stared at his palm. A faint, red mark was blooming there, the mark of a sunwalker's touch. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp agony. "Your scent. It's like a ghost of something I burned a long time ago." Talia looked up then, meeting his gaze. For one heartbeat, the amber in her eyes flared into brilliant gold. "I am the one you forgot, Braden," she whispered. Before he could respond, the nursery was flooded with light. Countess Alara stood at the door, flanked by the royal guard. "Braden, move away from her!" Alara shrieked, her face a mask of feigned terror. "The alchemist was right. She is a vessel for the Daystar. She is trying to incinerate the prince." The guards moved in. Talia felt the child's fear behind her, and her new power roared in response. The room began to glow with an unbearable intensity. "Don't touch me," Talia warned, her voice vibrating with a power that made the very glass of the palace windows hum. Braden stood between his servant and his future queen, caught in a whirlwind of magic and memory. He looked at Talia, the girl he had ignored for months, and for the first time in 8 centuries, the king of the undead felt the warmth of the sun. "Seize her," Alara commanded. As the guards lunged, Talia didn't fight back with fists. She let out a breath, and a wave of pure white heat pushed everyone back, slamming the heavy oak doors shut. In the sudden silence of the nursery, Talia turned to the child, her heart breaking. She wasn't strong enough yet to take him. The palace was a fortress of shadows, and she was a single spark. "I will come back for you, Leo," she whispered, kissing the child's forehead. "And I will burn this palace to the ground to keep you safe." She turned to the balcony, the moon hanging low and silver in the sky. With the grace of a creature made of light, she vaulted over the edge, disappearing into the jagged darkness of the iron crags. Braden reached the balcony a second too late. He stared into the night, his hand pressed against his heart, feeling the first spark of a fire he thought had gone out forever. "Talia," he breathed, the name tasting like ash and hope on his tongue. The aftermath of the nursery encounter hung over the obsidian palace like a suffocating shroud of silk and iron. For 2 days the halls were silent, save for the frantic whispers of the servants and the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of Countess Alara's heels as she oversaw the preparations for the great masquerade. Talia had not fled the mountains. She couldn't. The pull of the child, the tether of the prince's violet eyes, acted as a spiritual anchor, dragging her back from the precipice of the wild crags. She had spent 48 hours hiding in the salt veins, the ancient, abandoned tunnels beneath the palace where the air tasted of minerals and the earth's deep heat. There, in the absolute dark, she had looked at her hands. They didn't just glow, they pulsed. Every time she thought of Braden's hand on her arm, or the way Alara had sneered at her broken mind, the gold in her veins surged. She wasn't just remembering her past, she was evolving. The trauma of the River of Ash, the place where Alara's mages had tried to drown her in holy water and silver, had acted like a forge. It hadn't destroyed the Sunwalker in her. It had tempered her. On the third night, the night of the masquerade, Talia returned. She didn't enter as a queen. She entered through the scullery, her face smudged with soot, her radiant eyes hooded by a heavy, tattered cloak she'd stolen from a laundry line. To the guards, she was just another expendable thrall tasked with moving the heavy crates of blood wine. To the world, the ghost girl was still a shadow, but the shadow was carrying a sun. The ballroom of eclipses was a marvel of architectural arrogance. 1,000 chandeliers made of weeping crystal hung from a ceiling painted to look like a bleeding sky. The guests, the highest-ranking vampires from the southern wastes to the frost canyons, wore masks of gold, bone, and feathers. It was a sea of velvet and violence, where every smile was a display of fangs, and every dance was a negotiation of power. Braden sat upon his throne, his mask a snarling wolf cast in black iron. He looked magnificent, but his energy was jagged. He hadn't slept. He hadn't fed. He could still feel the phantom heat of the girl's touch on his skin. Beside him, Alara preened. She wore a dress of crimson scales that shimmered like a serpent's skin, her own mask a delicate filigree of silver that highlighted her predatory eyes. "You are distant, my king," Alara whispered, leaning close enough that her perfume, that cloying black orchid, clogged his senses. "The council expects the announcement tonight. The union of our houses will stabilize the borders. It is what the people need. It is what Leo needs." At the mention of his son, Braden's hand tightened on the arm of his throne, the marble cracking under his strength. "My son needs his mother," he growled, his voice a low vibration that made the nearby wineglasses tremble. "His mother is dust," Alara said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "That creature in the nursery was a delusion. A trick of the light. My mages have confirmed she was a spy, a remnant of the Solaris rebels using glamours to mimic your dead mate's scent." Braden turned to her, his amber eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "She didn't mimic it, Alara. She was it." Before Alara could respond, the music swelled. A haunting melody played on violins, strung with silver wire. It was time for the pouring of the vows. In this ritual, the lowliest servants would carry the great decanter of ancient blood to the royal dais. The king and his intended would drink together, binding their houses in a blood contract that not even death could easily sever. Talia stepped out from behind a heavy velvet curtain, her head bowed. She was one of the 4 servants carrying the gold filigree tray. Her heart was a drum in her ears, each beat echoing the word, mate, mate, mate. She reached the dais. The air around Braden felt like a storm. She could smell the ozone on him, the scent of the man she had loved before the world went dark. She could see the way his fingers twitched, the way he looked at the servants with a desperate, searching hunger. "Pour," Alara commanded, her eyes fixed on Talia. Talia stepped forward. As she lifted the heavy crystal decanter, her sleeve slipped. The scar on her wrist, a crescent moon branded into her skin during her wedding to Braden, was visible for a fraction of a second. Braden's breath hitched. He lunged forward, catching Talia's wrist before she could pour a single drop. The crystal decanter shattered on the floor, the dark, thick blood splashing across Alara's crimson gown. The music stopped. 1,000 vampires froze in mid-twirl. "You!" Braden breathed. He didn't care about the broken ritual. He didn't care about the shocked gasps of the nobles. He pulled Talia closer, his other hand coming up to rip the hood from her head. Her pale hair fell in a silken waterfall over her shoulders, and her eyes, no longer hidden, blazed with the ferocity of a desert noon. "Talia," he whispered, the word a prayer and a sob. "My king," she replied, her voice no longer a rasp, but a melody of power. "Guards!" Alara shrieked, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Kill her! She has attempted to poison the king. Look at the blood. It's tainted by her light." It was true. Where the blood wine had splashed onto the floor, it was bubbling and hissing, turning into gold steam where Talia's aura touched it. The royal guards, conditioned to obey the queen consort in matters of security, drew their blades. Braden stepped in front of Talia, his black steel sword clearing its scabbard with a sound like a scream. "Touch her," he roared, his alpha aura exploding outward, "and I will feed your hearts to the hounds." "She is an imposter, Braden," Alara cried, stepping toward them, her hand surreptitiously reaching for a vial of black liquid hidden in her bodice. "She is a Daystarer. She will burn us all. Look at her. She isn't even a vampire anymore. She is a monster." Talia stepped out from behind Braden's broad back. She felt the sensuality of the moment, the heat of Braden's body behind her, the electric tension of a room full of predators, and the absolute certainty of her own blood. "I am the monster you created, Alara," Talia said. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the royal banquet table. The wood began to smoke. Then, with a sudden, violent surge of will, Talia didn't just glow, she ignited. A pillar of pure, white solar fire erupted from her body, shooting toward the ceiling. The crystal chandeliers shattered. The velvet curtains burst into flames. The vampires in the front row screamed, diving for the shadows as the light poison of a Solaris queen filled the room. But the fire didn't hurt Braden. He stood in the center of the inferno, his eyes wide, watching as the woman he loved transformed into a goddess of the sun. The black magic noose around his neck, the curse Alara had fed him, withered and snapped under the heat. His memories flooded back. The night of the eclipse. The way Talia had looked in the moonlight, her skin glowing as she birthed their son. The sight of Alara standing over her with a silver dagger. "You!" Braden turned to Alara, his voice a death knell. "You told me she burned. You told me the sun took her." "The sun should have taken her," Alara screamed, dropping the vial. The black liquid hissed on the floor, summoning a cloud of shadow wraiths, monstrous, formless things made of dark sorcery. "If she won't die, then I will kill the both of you and take the throne by the blood of the covenant." The wraiths lunged. They were creatures of the void, designed to consume light. They swarmed over Talia, their cold, ethereal claws tearing at her radiance. Talia stumbled, the sheer weight of the darkness pressing against her lungs. She felt the cold seep into her bones, the ghost girl trying to pull her back into the hollow silence of memory loss. Then, she felt a hand on her waist. Braden pulled her back against his chest. His skin was cool, a perfect counterpoint to her heat. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Feed from me, Talia," he whispered, his voice thick with a dark, ancient sensuality. "My blood is yours. My life is yours. Take the darkness from my veins and turn it into fire." Talia didn't hesitate. She turned in his arms, her fingers locking into the thick fur of his cloak. She looked up at him, her golden eyes meeting his amber ones. The world around them was a chaos of fire and shadow, but in this small circle of space, there was only the two of them. She tilted her head back, exposing her throat, but it was Braden who bared his neck to her. A king had never fed a queen in the history of the Obsidian Palace. It was a subversion of every law of the undead. Talia leaned in. She could smell the rain and the ozone on his skin. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic thrum of his ancient heart. She opened her mouth, her fangs, longer and sharper than any standard vampire's, glittering like diamonds. She bit down. The rush was instantaneous. Braden's blood wasn't just liquid. It was history. It was power. It was the collective strength of 1,000 years of war and survival. As it flowed into her, Talia felt her solar core stabilize. The fire within her stopped being a wild, flickering flame and became a focused, incandescent laser. She pulled away, her lips stained with his dark blood, her skin shimmering with an intensity that made the shadows of the wraiths dissolve into nothingness. "Now," Talia said, her voice echoing with the authority of the sun, "let's show them what happens when you wake a queen." She raised her arms, and the fire in the room responded. It didn't just burn, it hunted. The solar flames tracked the wraiths, incinerating them in mid-air. The nobles who had supported Alara found themselves ringed by circles of white heat, trapped and helpless. Alara tried to flee, her crimson scales smoking, but the doors to the ballroom of eclipses were no longer oak. They were walls of solid, shimmering light. Braden stepped forward, his sword pointed at Alara's throat. "The masquerade is over, Countess," he said. But Alara laughed, a broken, hysterical sound. "You think you've won? The Covenant of Shadows is already at the gates. They don't just want the throne, Braden. They want the boy. And while you were playing at romance, my mages were already taking him from the spire." Talia's heart stopped. She looked toward the north spire, her mother sense screaming. The prince was gone. Talia turned to Braden, her eyes filled with a terrifying, holy wrath. "Find the mages," she commanded, the solar fire in the room flaring to white-hot levels. I'm going to get our son, and then I'm going to show the Covenant why the sun is the only thing a vampire should truly fear. She didn't wait for a carriage or a horse. She burst through the ballroom window, her light trailing behind her like a comet as she ascended toward the high peaks, the war for the Obsidian Palace finally moving from the shadows into the blinding light of day. The sky above the iron crags was no longer the velvet black of a mountain night. It was a bruised, sickly violet, choked by the soot of the ballroom's fires and the encroaching void magic of the Covenant of Shadows. Talia ascended the jagged peaks not as a woman, but as a streak of solar radiation, her body humming with the stolen strength of Braden's blood. The wind howled against her, carrying the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of the void mist, a sorcerous fog designed to swallow light and life alike. Every time her mother sense flared, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain pierced her chest. She could feel Leo. He was cold. He was terrified, and he was being moved further away from the safety of the Obsidian Palace, toward the Sun Eater's Maw, a fortress carved into the side of a dead volcano, where the rays of the sun had been forbidden to touch the earth for an eternity. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic beat of massive wings. She turned mid-air, her light casting long, distorted shadows against the canyon walls. Braden was behind her, having taken his Night Stalker form, a gargantuan, bat-winged shadow beast with eyes like burning coals. He pulled level with her, the sheer displacement of air from his wings nearly knocking her off her course. The Covenant has a head start. Braden's voice echoed in her mind, a dark, resonant rumble. The Maw is protected by ancient silver glass. If you fly into it blindly, your own light will reflect back and incinerate you. Talia didn't slow down. They have our son, Braden. I will melt the glass with my bare hands if I have to. I know, he replied, and for the first time, she felt the true depth of his predatory love, not just a king's duty, but a father's feral desperation. But we must be surgical. Alara didn't just want power. She wanted a sacrifice. The Maw is a conduit. If they drain Leo's solar essence into the volcano's core, they will create a permanent eclipse, a world of eternal night, where we are nothing but cattle to the High Coven. They reached the summit of the crags, and the Sun Eater's Maw came into view. It was a grotesque structure, a jagged tower of obsidian and bone that seemed to be drinking the moonlight. Around it, hundreds of hooded figures, the Covenant mages, were chanting in a low, discordant drone that made Talia's teeth ache. I'll draw their fire, Braden commanded, his wings tucking into a lethal dive. The shadows belong to me. When the darkness erupts, you strike from the sun. The battle began with a scream of cold iron. Braden hit the perimeter of the Maw like a meteor of shadow. He was a whirlwind of claws and ancient fangs, tearing through the Covenant's thralls with a brutality that had earned him his throne. The mages shrieked, throwing bolts of black lightning at him, but Braden moved like smoke, disappearing into one shadow and emerging from another to rip out a throat or shatter a staff. This was Talia's window. She plummeted from the sky, her light condensed into a singular, blinding spear. She hit the roof of the Maw, the silver glass groaning under the thermal shock. Crack! The glass didn't just break, it exploded into dust. Talia dropped through the hole, landing in a vaulted chamber that smelled of incense and old copper. At the center of the room was a stone altar, etched with runes that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening purple light. Tied to the altar was a small bundle of white silk. Leo! Talia's voice was a sob and a snarl. She rushed forward, but she was stopped by a wall of solidified darkness. Out of the corners of the room stepped the high mages of the Covenant, their faces hidden behind masks carved from human bone, and at the head of the altar stood Alara. She looked different. Her skin had turned a mottled, bruised gray, and her eyes were leaking a black, oily substance. She had traded her beauty for the void. You're late, little ghost, Alara sneered, her voice sounding like two stones grinding together. The ritual has already begun. The boy's heart is the key, and his blood is the lock. Talia looked at the altar. Leo was silent, his violet eyes wide and glazed, his tiny chest heaving. The purple runes were drinking the gold from his skin, siphoning his Solaris essence into the floor. Let him go, Alara, Talia said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The air in the room began to shimmer. The temperature rose 10 degrees, 20, 30. The silk tapestries on the walls began to curl and brown. Or what? Alara mocked. You'll burn me? I've already tasted the void, Talia. I've seen the end of the sun. Your light is just a flickering candle in the maw of the universe. Alara raised a silver dagger, the same one she had used on the night of the eclipse. She aimed it at the child's heart. Now, Alara whispered. Watch the world go dark. Talia didn't think. She didn't plan. She let the last of her human restraint shatter. She didn't just attack. She became an event. She lunged, not with a blade, but with her entire being. The wall of darkness didn't just break, it evaporated. Talia's hand closed around Alara's wrist, and the sound of the Countess's bones turning to ash was drowned out by the roar of the fire. "You took my life," Talia growled, her face inches from Alara's. "You took my memories. You took my son's peace." Talia's grip tightened, and white fire began to pour from her fingertips into Alara's veins. The Countess screamed, a sound of pure, unholy agony as the solar light fought the void rot inside her. "I am the Sun Queen," Talia proclaimed, her voice echoing through the fortress like a divine judgment. "And the sun does not negotiate with the dark." With a final surge of power, Talia threw Alara across the room. The Countess hit the silver glass wall and shattered it, her body dissolving into a pile of gray ash before she even hit the floor. Talia turned to the altar. The runes were still pulsing, still drinking Leo's life. She reached out, her hands trembling, and touched the child's chest. "Leo, look at me," she pleaded. "Mother is here. Give me the cold. Give me the darkness." She began to draw the purple void magic out of his body and into her own. It felt like swallowing needles. The cold was agonizing, a frost that threatened to extinguish her solar core. Her skin turned blue, then gray. Her light flickered, the room dimming as the void magic fought to kill her from the inside out. "I am the ghost girl," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. "Just go back to the dark. It's easier there. No pain, no memory." "No," Talia gasped, her fingers clutching the stone altar. "I am his mother." She thought of Braden. She thought of the way his blood had tasted, the salt, the iron, the ancient strength. She thought of the way he looked at her in the nursery, that split second of recognition that had broken through 8 centuries of ice. She found a spark, a tiny, defiant ember of Solaris fire at the base of her soul. She fanned it. She fed it her love, her rage, her very identity. The ember became a flame. The flame became an explosion. Talia let out a scream that shook the volcano to its roots. A wave of pure, white-hot energy rippled out from her, incinerating the mages, melting the stone altar, and shattering every piece of silver glass in the maw. The darkness was gone. Talia collapsed onto the melting floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached out, her fingers brushing the silk of the bundle. A tiny, warm hand curled around her finger. Leo let out a soft, healthy gurgle, his violet eyes clear and bright. The Solaris gold had returned to his skin. The ceiling of the maw had been completely blown away, leaving the room open to the sky. Braden landed among the ruins, shifting back into his human form. His clothes were torn, his skin covered in the black soot of the mages, but his eyes were fixed on the woman on the floor. He crossed the room in a blur of motion, falling to his knees beside her. He gathered Talia and Leo into his arms, pulling them against his chest with a strength that was almost painful. "Is he?" Braden's voice was a broken whisper. "He's fine," Talia rasped, leaning her head against Braden's shoulder. She could smell the rain and the ozone on him, and it was the sweetest thing she had ever known. "He's a Solaris prince, Braden. It'll take more than a few witches to dim his light." Braden let out a shuddering breath, his forehead resting against hers. "And you? You took the void into yourself." "I burned it," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. I think the ghost girl is finally dead." Braden pulled back just enough to look at her. The moon was high now, casting a silver light over the ruins of the maw. He looked at her with an intensity that made Talia's breath hitch, not just a king looking at his queen, but a man looking at his soul. "The ghost girl never existed," Braden said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You were always the sun, Talia. I was just too blind to see you." He leaned in, and this time, the kiss wasn't about blood or power. It was about the 8 months of silence. It was about the promises made under an eclipse. It was a kiss of fire and ice, a collision of 2 worlds that should never have met, but were now inseparable. Talia closed her eyes, letting herself melt into him. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't cold. She wasn't empty. She was home. But as they sat there, amidst the ash of their enemies, a low rumble started deep within the volcano. Talia pulled away, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the cracked floor. The ritual hadn't been entirely stopped. The void magic she had purged had seeped into the magma of the volcano, and the earth itself was beginning to reject the light. "We have to go," Braden said, standing and pulling her up with him. "The maw is collapsing, and the High Coven, they were only the vanguard." Talia looked out over the horizon. In the distance, toward the northern wastes, a massive cloud of darkness was moving toward the Obsidian Palace. It wasn't magic. It was an army. "The Covenant of Shadows doesn't give up," Talia said, her grip tightening on Leo. Her eyes flared with that new, stable gold. "They think they can extinguish the sun." Braden drew his sword, the black steel singing in the night air. Then let's show them, he said, what happens when the sun and the night fight together. They took to the sky, the King of Shadows and the Queen of Light, flying back toward their palace to defend the dawn. The obsidian palace stood like a sentinel against the coming storm. When they landed on the royal balcony, the remaining court was in a state of chaos. Nobles were packing jewels. Servants were fleeing into the lower tunnels. But when Talia stepped forward, her crown of solar fire manifesting around her brow, the panic died. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a servant. She looked like the end of an era. Man the ramparts! Talia's voice carried to every corner of the palace. Open the armory. Any vampire who can hold a blade, stand with your king. We are no longer hiding in the dark. The vampires of the Obsidian Palace, inspired by a power they hadn't seen in a millennium, stopped running. They turned. They drew their steel. Braden stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back. What's the plan, my queen? Talia looked at the approaching darkness. She could feel the solar energy of the coming dawn building behind the horizon. We don't wait for them to hit the walls, Talia said. We meet them in the pass. I'm going to turn the iron crags into a mirror. When the sun rises, there won't be a shadow left in this valley. She looked at Leo, who was now being held by the old groundskeeper, the only person who had been kind to her when she was the ghost girl. Watch the prince, Talia commanded. Then, she turned to Braden, her eyes a brilliant, defiant gold. Ready to make history? Braden smiled, a jagged, lethal expression. I've been waiting 800 years for a fight like this. They leaped from the balcony, two streaks of impossible power, heading straight into the heart of the Shadow Army as the first faint line of gold began to crack the eastern sky. Talia has saved her son, but the war for the dawn has only just begun. The iron crags groaned as if the earth itself were being flayed. The army of the Covenant of Shadows was not a force of flesh and bone. It was a tide of living night, a sea of obsidian-armored wraiths and blood-starved zealots who had traded their souls for a drop of the void's cold power. They spilled through the mountain passes like ink dropped into clear water, extinguishing the moonlight wherever they trod. Talia stood at the vanguard, her feet planted on the jagged lip of the Devil's Throat, the narrowest pass leading to the Obsidian Palace. Beside her, Braden stood in his human form, though his skin was etched with the black veins of his ancient power. They were outnumbered 10,000 to 1, a flicker of light and a shadow standing against an ocean of nothingness. They are beautiful in their hate, aren't they? Braden mused, his voice a low silk rasp that vibrated against Talia's senses. Even now, with death marching toward them, the air between them was electric, thick with a sensuality that was both a shield and a weapon. Talia turned to him. The wind whipped her hair, now a brilliant, incandescent white, across her face. They are a mistake, Braden. A shadow that has forgotten it needs light to exist. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Her skin was hot, radiating a gentle, golden warmth that made Braden's pupils dilate. He leaned into her touch, his fangs grazing the sensitive pads of her fingers. The hunger between them was no longer just about blood. It was a cosmic alignment. The King of the Night and the Queen of the Day, two halves of a broken world, finally snapping back together. If we fall today, Braden whispered, his hand sliding down to grip her waist, pulling her flush against his armored chest. I want the last thing I feel to be your fire. Talia leaned up, her lips brushing his. The kiss was a collision of extremes, the chill of his immortality meeting the nuclear furnace of her soul. It tasted of copper, ozone, and ancient promises. We aren't falling, Braden. I've spent too long in the dark. I'm not going back. She pulled away, her eyes igniting. The amber was gone, replaced by a white-hot radiance that turned the surrounding stones to glass. The sun is coming, she said, looking toward the horizon. Let's give them a dawn they'll feel in their marrow. The battle began with a roar that shook the stars. The Covenant's vanguard, monstrous, multi-limbed horrors stitched together from shadow flesh, charged up the slope. Braden met them first. He didn't just fight, he danced. He moved with a predatory grace that was sickeningly beautiful, his black steel blade a blur of decapitations and dismemberments. He was a shadow among shadows, appearing behind his enemies to rip out hearts that beat with black ichor. Talia, however, was a stationary storm. She raised her arms, and the iron crags responded. The mountains were rich in quartz and obsidian, natural conductors. She reached out with her mind, tapping into the solar energy currently hidden beneath the horizon. She didn't wait for the sun to rise. She reached around the curve of the earth and pulled. Solaris, rise! A beam of pure, concentrated sunlight shot out from her chest, piercing the gloom. It didn't just illuminate the wraiths, it vaporized them. Where the light touched the black armor of the Covenant, the metal turned to liquid, screaming as it melted into the flesh beneath. But the high priests of the void were not easily deterred. They gathered on the surrounding ridges, their voices joining in a discordant chant, that summoned a shadow eclipse. A massive, swirling vortex of darkness formed directly above the pass, blocking out the stars and counteracting Talia's light. The temperature plummeted. Talia felt the frost creeping up her legs, the void trying to snuff out her core once again. "Braden!" she cried out. He was there in an instant, a whirlwind of violence that cleared a circle around her. He grabbed her hand, his cool skin acting as a heat sink for the overwhelming power she was trying to channel. "Together," he growled. He didn't just hold her, he opened his veins to her. He bit his own wrist and pressed it to her lips. Talia drank, the ancient, cold power of the King of Night flowing into her solar veins. It should have killed her. The two energies, the void shadow of Braden's blood and the Solaris fire of her soul, were matter and antimatter. Instead, they mated. Inside Talia, the energy swirled into a breathtaking spiral of twilight power. She wasn't just a sunwalker anymore. She was something the world had never seen, a weaver of the eclipse. She let out a breath, and the aura that erupted from her was no longer white or gold. It was a shimmering, lethal violet, the color of her son's eyes. Talia leaped into the air, her wings of violet flame unfurling for miles. She flew directly into the heart of the shadow eclipse vortex. The darkness screamed as she entered it. It felt like being torn apart by 1,000 frozen claws. But Talia leaned into the sensation, her sensuality heightening as she felt the raw, primal force of the universe rushing through her. She felt every vampire in the valley, their fear, their hunger, their tiny, flickering lives. "I am the balance," she roared. She clapped her hands together. The resulting shockwave didn't just break the eclipse, it shattered the mountain ridges where the mages stood. The shadow eclipse didn't dissipate, it exploded inward, turning into a rain of violet fire that hunted every member of the Covenant with unerring precision. Below, Braden watched his mate with a terrifying pride. He saw her suspended in the sky, a goddess of the violet dawn, and he knew that the age of the Covens was over. The age of the family had begun. The final stand occurred at the gates of the Obsidian Palace. The last of the Covenant's elite, the Black Guard, had managed to bypass the Devil's Throat and were battering the glass gates. They were led by a figure in tattered, gray robes, a remnant of the High Oracle who had helped Alara. Talia descended from the sky like a falling star, her violet wings scorching the ground as she landed. Braden was at her side a second later, his human skin smoking from the proximity to her heat. "You're tired," Braden noted, his eyes scanning her pale, sweat-slicked face. Despite the carnage, the sight of her disheveled, powerful, and fierce stirred a deep, protective lust in him. "I'm finished playing," Talia replied. She looked at the oracle. The creature was a hollowed-out husk, its eyes replaced by swirling pools of void ink. "The sun will not save you, little queen," the oracle hissed. "The void is eternal. We are the silence that follows the scream." "Then let me give you something to be silent about," Talia said. She didn't use fire. She used the earth. She slammed her palms into the ground, and the volcanic glass of the palace floor rose up, forming a forest of jagged spikes. The Black Guard were impaled instantly, their shadow flesh dissolving into the stone. The oracle tried to cast a final curse, a heart-rot spell aimed at Braden, but Talia was faster. She moved with a speed that defied the eye, appearing in front of the oracle and catching the curse in her bare hand. She crushed the spell like a dry leaf. Then, she leaned in, her eyes boring into the oracle's hollow sockets. "Tell the void," Talia whispered, "that the sun has come home." She kissed the oracle's forehead. It was a kiss of absolute light. The creature didn't just die, it was overwritten. Every molecule of darkness in its body was replaced by blinding radiance, until it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces of glowing dust. The valley went silent. The remaining Covenant soldiers, seeing their oracle destroyed and their eclipse shattered, threw down their weapons and fled into the wastes. They would be hunted for decades, but the war for the Obsidian Palace was won. Talia stood in the center of the courtyard, the violet flames of her wings slowly receding. She was exhausted, her dress in tatters, her skin covered in soot and the blood of her enemies. Braden approached her slowly. He didn't say a word. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, his face burying in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in, the scent of sunshine and rain, and for the first time in 800 years, the king felt a sense of peace that wasn't born of conquest. "It's over," he whispered against her skin. Talia leaned back, her hands framing his face. The violet glow in her eyes was fading back to a soft, warm amber, but the power was still there, humming beneath the surface. "Not over," she said, her voice rich with a new, deeper sensuality. "It's beginning, Braden." She looked up at the high balcony. The old groundskeeper stood there, holding Prince Leo. The child was quiet, his violet eyes fixed on his parents. Even from this distance, Talia could feel his warmth, his pride. Braden followed her gaze. He looked at his son, then back at his mate. He reached out, his thumb tracing the curve of Talia's lower lip. I spent 8 centuries building a kingdom of shadows, Braden said, his voice thick with emotion. I think I'm ready to live in the light. He leaned down, and this time, the kiss was slow, deep, and filled with a desperate, lingering heat. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found his way out of a labyrinth. Talia responded with a hunger of her own, her body molding against his, the fire and the night finally finding their perfect equilibrium. Around them, the servants and the surviving nobles began to emerge from the palace. They didn't cheer, they knelt. It was a silent acknowledgement of the power that now ruled the Iron Crags. The ghost girl was gone. The relentless king had been softened. As the first true ray of sunlight finally cracked the horizon, hitting the spires of the obsidian palace and turning the volcanic glass to a brilliant shimmering gold, Talia looked toward the dawn. The world was changing. The night was no longer a place of fear, and the day was no longer a place of exile. Let's go get our son, Talia said, her hand interlocking with Braden's. Together they walked into the palace, the sun rising behind them, casting a long, single shadow that belonged to both of them. The sun did not merely rise over the Iron Crags on the morning of the coronation. It conquered them. The obsidian palace, once a jagged tooth of shadow in a world of gloom, had been transformed. Thousands of mirrors, polished by the hands of 1,000 liberated thralls, had been angled along the mountain ridges to catch the dawn. The volcanic glass of the citadel now shimmered with an inner, liquid gold, as if the very stone had been baptized in fire. Inside the great throne room, the atmosphere was thick, with a sensuality that was no longer hidden in the dark. It was the scent of blooming jasmine, heated skin, and the crisp, clean ozone of a fading storm. The high-born vampires, once cold and statuesque, moved with a new, vibrant energy. They had seen the sun, and they had survived it. Talia stood in the royal antechamber, staring at her reflection. She wore a gown crafted from solar silk, a fabric woven from the light she had channeled during the battle. It clung to her curves like a second skin, flowing behind her in a train of living radiance. Her hair was a crown of white gold, and her skin, once the sickly pale of a ghost, now glowed with a healthy, incandescent warmth. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Talia leaned back into Braden's chest, closing her eyes as she felt the cool silk of his formal tunics against her bare shoulders. He pressed his lips to the sensitive curve where her neck met her shoulder, his fangs grazing her skin just enough to send a shiver of heat through her veins. "You look like the dawn itself," Braden whispered, his voice a low, dark velvet. Talia turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. Braden was no longer the icy, distant monarch she had scrubbed floors for. The relentless king had become a man whose every gaze was a confession of love. His amber eyes were clear, the black veins of the void curse gone forever. "And you," Talia said, her fingers tracing the silver embroidery of his cloak, "look like a man who finally knows where he belongs." Braden gripped her chin, tilting her head back. His kiss was slow and possessive, a deep exploration that tasted of the future they had fought for. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with a lingering, protective lust. The court is waiting, but more importantly, the history books are waiting to be rewritten. The doors to the throne room swung open, and the herald's voice rang out, echoing off the newly polished marble. "Kneel for the Solaris Queen. Kneel for the High King of the Eclipse." As Talia and Braden walked down the aisle, the sea of vampires dropped to their knees, not out of fear, but out of a profound instinctive reverence. At the foot of the dais stood the High Oracle Seraphina, who had survived the battle and now wore robes of shimmering lavender in honor of the prince. And there, in a small, carved cradle of white oak, sat Prince Leo. He let out a joyful gurgle as his parents approached, his tiny hands reaching for the light Talia emitted. "Talia of the Solaris line," Seraphina began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You were forgotten, but the sun does not forget its own. You were broken, but the fire only made you stronger. Do you take this crown, and this king, to rule the Iron Crags in the balance of light and shadow?" "I do," Talia said, her voice clear and unwavering. Seraphina placed a crown of woven gold and diamond onto Talia's head. As the metal touched her brow, a pulse of pure white light rippled through the hall, momentarily blinding everyone. When the light faded, Talia sat upon the moonstone throne, beside Braden's obsidian one. But there was one final matter of state. "Bring forth the prisoner," Braden commanded. The heavy iron doors at the back of the hall creaked open. 2 guards dragged a figure forward. She was dressed in the tattered, gray rags of a kitchen thrall. Her hands were red and peeling from lye, and her face was smudged with soot. It was Alara. She hadn't died in the volcano. Talia had deliberately kept a spark of her life flickering, not out of mercy, but for justice. The void had been stripped from her, leaving her a mortal, aging woman, her beauty fading as quickly as a cut flower. Alara looked up at the thrones, her eyes filled with a desperate, impotent hatred. She saw the woman she had mocked and tortured, sitting in the seat of power. She saw the man she had tried to ensnare, looking at that woman with a devotion Alara could never inspire. "The stain on the flagstones in the north corridor," Talia spoke, her voice calm and cold. "It has been there for longer than I can remember. The head housekeeper says it won't come out." Talia leaned forward, her crown shimmering. "You will spend every night for the rest of your mortal life scrubbing that stone, Alara. You will be the ghost of this palace. No one will speak to you. No one will see you. You will be as invisible as I was." Alara let out a strangled cry of rage and humiliation as the guards dragged her away. She would spend her final years in the silence she had tried to impose on Talia, a living reminder that the shadows always flee before the sun. That night, after the feasts were over and the guests had retired, Talia and Braden stood on the highest balcony of the palace. The valley below was no longer a place of terror. Tiny lanterns glowed in the windows of the village, and the iron crags seemed to hum with a quiet, peaceful energy. Prince Leo was asleep in the nursery, guarded by the most loyal warriors in the kingdom. Braden pulled Talia against him, his cloak wrapping around both of them like a wing. The air was cool, but Talia's heat kept them perfectly warm. "I used to stand here and wonder why the stars felt so cold," Braden said, his chin resting on the top of her head. Talia turned in his embrace, her arms looping around his neck. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with a sensuality that promised a very different kind of celebration now that the world was at peace. "And now?" she asked. Braden smiled, a true, warm expression that reached his eyes. He leaned down, his lips hovering just an inch from hers. "Now, I don't care about the stars. I have the sun right here." He kissed her then, a deep, soul-searing embrace that spoke of centuries yet to come. The ghost girl was a memory. The relentless king was a partner. And as the moon moved across the sky, casting a soft violet glow over the obsidian palace, the light and the shadow finally became one. The dawn would come again, as it always did, but for the first time in the history of the Iron Crags, no one was afraid of the light. The end.